as Peter said, I'm a councillor, and my role with the LGA is that I am a deputy chair of the Improvement and Innovation Board, and under that I have the portfolio of productivity and efficiency, which includes procurement amongst other things. My day job, if you like, is in Pembrokeshire County Council, so I'm in West Wales. It's a beautiful day here as well at the moment. I'm assuming it's beautiful wherever it is. But it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I think you've had some etiquette guidelines circulated before the meeting. So, Grace, are you going to, if you nod at me, Grace, or shake your head? Yeah, okay, that's good. So we won't go through that. I'll introduce Colin Murray from DWF Law in a moment, or I'll hand over to Colin. But basically, thank you for joining this afternoon. It's a joint webinar with the Business Services Association and the LGA, and it's around us discussing the climate emergency and how local government and business can work together to help us meet our local carbon reduction goals. There's a number of things that we'll be talking through this afternoon, 2 separate sessions, work of local authorities in the climate emergency and preventing climate change, working in partnership, and I think really interestingly as well at the moment, about how we can take the learnings from what we're going through at the moment and apply those to whatever future it is that we want to create for ourselves. So, Chris, I'm not sure whether we were going to show us a slide of that. There's a scenario that you'd asked me to talk about very briefly, which I'll give you a second, or whoever's. Sadie, you're driving, aren't you today? Yes. Well, hang on for a second. I'm still getting to grips with this online chair business. Yes, I can.
Okay. Can everyone see that? Yeah. Yeah.
That's great.
Excellent.
Would you mind moving on to that? That I think it's the first slide then, Sadie, isn't it? Keep going. There we go. Yeah. So this was. So I came across this. I'm not sure if you can see it clearly. I'm not going to spend a massive amount of time on this before I hand over to Colin. But I came across this reading something recently in the MJ. And they had talked about some emerging thinking for the future. This is probably 6-7 weeks ago. And then I've written a blog recently, which is about learning through crisis. And I thought that this scenario was really interesting. I mean, clearly there's lots of other scenarios that were available if you want to find something else. But I was really interested in the top right here, which is where you have local government leading a response to the pandemic, and you have high transformation in services. And really there's 3 things in that top right corner for me, which is about the learning. So it's how we take the learning of what we're going through at the moment. It's about working in partnership, and some of those areas will be discussed on today's call. So working with the VCSCs, working with business, and ultimately it's about driving change through civic renewal. I'm not an expert in climate change. I am on Pembrokeshire County Council's climate change working group, and I did that because I wanted to learn more about it, and because we've obviously got to take action. And in various things in what I do, I've been a huge advocate of home working and remote working since I joined Pembrokeshire County Council. I've been a home worker. Well, the last time I had a fixed desk, actually, I tell people, anybody who will listen, was in the last century. So we've actually seen an amazing shift already with some of the initiatives that might be simple to implement to help us with climate change around home working and so on. But I was just interested in this as a potential model. And in my blog, I kind of also warn really about what might be the race back to normal, which is still where local government leads a response. And there's still some new ways of working, but where people are people are fed up really of being trapped in lockdown and want to get back to some kind of normality. So for me, I would say I'm fairly progressive. I'm really keen on how we can get to that top right corner, which is about local government leading a response and high transformation. So, Grace, I'm not sure if we were going to run a poll during the We are, okay, good. So there we go. And if you look at the meeting chat on the side as well, there's a poll there that we can do at any time throughout the workshop. So we're going to explore some of these thoughts through the workshop this afternoon, and about how we strengthen partnerships. But you've heard enough from me for the time being. I'm now going to hand over to Colin, who's going to run the first session, if that's okay. And Colin, I'll let you introduce yourself as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Thank you very much. Yes, my name's Colin Murray. I'm a partner at DWF, and I head up the local government team here, and we advise local authorities across the country, and a lot of private sector providers also providing services and works and so on to local authorities. I think we've got 20 minutes for this session and then 10 minutes for Q&A. And I think from the agenda, the key thing for us to get across in our session is to discuss really the climate emergency and how local authorities have responded. What work have local authorities done to date to prevent climate change? What are local authorities doing in order to encourage sustainable as well as inclusive growth as we emerge from lockdown? And also really what practical things that local authorities have done in order to reduce carbon emissions. So I think it is quite a timely session, if I dare say it. And for what it's worth, Councillor, I think I prefer your top right of your little diagram, by the way. I think that's where we should be heading. So if we get a poll on that, I think that's where we should be going. So I'm joined, and I just asked Martin and Mike to introduce themselves. Is that okay? So Martin, do you want to do so first?
Yeah, sure. My name is Martin, but I'm the Climate Change Manager at Hull City Council.
Okay, thank you. And Mike, I think you've managed to get off your other Teams call now to join us. Thank
yes,
you very much.
Apologies, I was slightly late there. Sorry, it's the danger of back-to-back diaries. But so I chair the BSA Energy Environmental Committee, so I think that's my sort of primary reason for being here today. But in addition, I am the managing director for the energy and compliance business for Interserve. So very much working what we're talking about today.
Oh, that's great. And Mike, you're going through like the rest of us, just back-to-back Teams calls. This is the new reality for all of us. We're out of our cars, but we're in sequential team calls for that forever. Okay.
We miss all those chats, don't we? So.
Yeah, we do. So, I mean, Martin, I know that you've got a few slides, haven't you, that you'd like to take us through, just to explain what's going on in Hull, because I think one of the key things that emerged from our DWF LGC work on climate emergency was the real strength of response from local authorities on a local authority by local authority basis. So I'll just pass over to you, please, Martin. Is that okay?
That's lovely. Yes, that's great, Colin. Thank you very much. Okay, could we go on to the sort of first slides, please, Sadie? So the next, that's it. So the Hull City Council declared a climate emergency, which is sort of driven by our elected members in April last year. And sort of over the past 12 months, we've been developing the strategy in response to that. And that was approved actually during lockdown in April this year. We actually approved the strategy, was approved by our cabinet then, and also will be going to our full council later in the year as well. Our carbon neutral Hull, and we have a 2030 target that was agreed in Hull. It's based around these 8 areas of work, really. It's around heat, power, mobility, consumption, the fair transition, carbon sequestration, skills and jobs, and innovation. As really, because these are the key areas we need to tackle in terms of areas that we need to decarbonise, but also in terms of grabbing some of the opportunities around innovation and skills and jobs growth within the local authority area, and how we can incentivise businesses to deliver that. But also key for us also is ensuring that it's a fair transition, because we need to take our communities with us as local authorities. And obviously the experience of the past few months and over the next 12 months is going to be a real challenge for quite a lot of our communities, particularly with expected increasing rates of unemployment. So that fair transition from decarbonisation becomes even more crucial to ensure that we take our communities with us on this journey, and don't exclude communities through what we actually do. So it's a very difficult process we have to go through and understand and feel our way and take our communities with us as we go along. But one of the issues that's was unusual, I think, about the climate emergency declaration in Hull was actually included consumption emissions as well as production emissions. As many of you will know, trying to get to carbon neutral just from production emissions is a significant challenge. And certainly the information that's put out by UK government in terms of our trying to get to zero carbon by 2050 doesn't actually include our consumption emissions. So it's a real challenge for us. So what we decided to do was actually get a better understanding of what the consumption emissions were of us as an authority, and those of the city as well, to see, well, how big is the challenge and what do we actually need to do? So next slide, please, Sadie. So if you look at the sort of UK's consumption emissions, they've only dropped really by 5% compared to the reductions we've seen across the other broad areas of carbon reduction, which shows the difficulty we really have in terms of trying to address consumption emissions as a city, but also as a country as well. And that's partly been driven really by the offshoring of a lot of our production and manufacturing processes, and the importation then of a lot of the consumer goods that we have and a lot of the key materials that we need for large infrastructure projects and a lot of the decarbonisation activities we need to do. And as a council, we have, relatively speaking, a small percentage of the city's total consumption emissions. We're only responsible for 6%. So while that is quite a small amount, it is a significant role that we can play as an authority in really leading the way in actually how you address consumption emissions and trying to better understand what that actually means for us as an authority. So as I said, we contracted with a company called Antithesis, who some of you may be aware of from the scatter pathways analysis toolkit that they've produced and run as well. So the consumption emissions really looked at both the city's consumption emissions as a whole, but also the local authorities, so we can understand, well, what are the key areas where our consumption emissions are generated, and how can we actually address these going forward? And what we found really was that the top 6 categories are responsible for 85% of our emissions. So relatively speaking, only a small number of our procurement categories are responsible for most of our consumption emissions, which means that we can quite clearly target our activity around these issues. And when it comes to the largest one, and it comes down to works, unsurprisingly, really, I think for most of us, the local authorities that are responsible for putting large infrastructure and regeneration projects within our areas, those of us that still have stock retained housing, that's where most of our consumptions derive, and it's from the construction process and from roads process as well. So it's quite a significant amount. And also it's interesting when you start to look at some of the data is that some of the categories have a higher CO2 emission per pound spent than other areas. And that's quite a key issue, I think, in terms of understanding where your effort should be and where your balance should be. So the next slide, please. So as you can see, you can see how the categories are represented in terms of consumption emissions, and works obviously being a significant element of that. And also we can see as well that it's then to the environmental services, utilities, understandably, which is obviously a gas and electricity consumption that we have as local authorities, and then adult services, finance and public transport, and then obviously a decreasing amount, but it enables us to focus quite clearly on those areas. And for us as an authority, it's caused us to start to go back into procurement and to start to understand much more clearly, well, how do we build this into the social value considerations that we have? How do we need to change the social value considerations within our procurement process? And how can we work with our suppliers to enable them to address their consumption emissions through the procurement process? And I think this goes back to has a much wider, much stronger relationship that local authorities, I think, need to have with their suppliers, and that I think maybe in the past we haven't engaged as much as we possibly can do. And this feeds across into a number of other areas as well, not just around consumption emissions we need to focus on, but also in terms of issues around climate adaptation, and how resilient our key suppliers are, and how we can work with them to increase their resilience in their climate adaptation of the products and services that they provide, but also for them as businesses as well. And so it's a part of us being able to enable and support the business sector through our procurement and using that relationship to move things forward. I just want to finish really on the last, the last slide. If you go to the last slide, please. So this shows really in terms of the authority, we've obviously the consumption emissions make up 6% of the city's total consumption. But in terms of our emissions as an authority, our greenhouse gas emissions from our scopes 1, 2 and 3, and we don't count everything within scope 3. We're not able to measure that all yet. But really, they just make up 12.4% of our consumption emissions. So our greatest climate impact is really around the emissions generated through consumption activity that we have as an authority. So it really is, that's where the challenge is for us as an authority, is actually how do we address that? Because production is hard enough as it is, but consumption really is the challenge I think we need to all get a better understanding of and start to provide some focus and some attention on. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Martin. That's really good, because it illustrates to what extent you've got under the skin of what's going on in your authority, frankly, and you've got some baselines from which you can now work.
What I really want to do is really just sort of touch on sort of in terms of the sort of climate emergency and sort of local response, really from a BSA perspective, how the Business Services Association, how we can help, and maybe just give some sort of clarify maybe on some misconceptions, and maybe sort of provide some sort of pointers, because I think, you know, this is one of those areas where I think the point's already been made, that the more of us that can work together in a sort of holistic way, the better the results we can get from this. So I think I just want to sort of share some ideas. So I think the first one for me is that the private sector, really, in terms of, you know, all those parties part of the Business Services Association, you know, they want and need to work with the public sector. You know, so I think there's absolutely no reason why, as all those parties, we can't all sort of come together to make things happen. And I think, you know, that sort of combination of need, demand, requirement, service provision, you know, is a really sort of fantastic mix, and one that we really shouldn't be afraid to sort of feed from. I think some pleas I would sort of probably make, or some observations, is that, you know, for all this to happen effectively, leadership is absolutely key. And it's right to have aspirational targets, but what we also sort of need is aspiration, but also with hard work, achievable. I think sometimes, you know, there can be a danger that we embark on journeys in this area to get to an objective, and we try to do the step we try to take in the first instance is too big, and it's almost a case of getting there by smaller incremental stages actually will get us to a much more effective, sustainable outcome, as opposed to setting something that it's too in the future, or too larger challenge, and can we actually get there in one step? And I think, you know, it's interesting looking at the figures in the previous deck in terms of where some of that energy consumption sits, and it's actually the incremental way of just nibbling away in each of those areas brings that graph down, but there isn't necessarily one big fix there. It's lots of smaller elements and how they sort of come together. And I think, you know, within that, you know, the other piece, then, it's also a combination of the different types of organisation that have a part to play. And the reality is, it's all types of organisation. There's big parties, small parties, and sometimes that traction. So I mean, I think all the examples have been made today in terms of sort of COVID and you know, if I take a personal example from Interserve, we were very heavily involved in the Nightingale hospitals, one which we constructed and another which we sort of fitted out and operated. And I think what you had there was a really good example where a large organisation can have you know, good big resource behind it that can make things happen and happen very swiftly. But the flip side of that is actually, you know, we also need those bright ideas, the sort of the boffins, if you want, the new bits of tech, those things which are, you know, maybe not yet tried or tested. And certainly if I look at it from my own business perspective, often there's a reticence to trial new things because we like to use things we understand because we can guarantee performance against those. We can be confident of the outcomes. But sometimes what we're actually looking for is customers and partners to work with where they actually want to push the boundaries. So together you say, look, well, let's embrace that piece of technology. Let's give it a go. It might not quite give what we want, but we're actually pushing, you know, with my sort of head on. It's often very difficult to find partners to work with who actually want to embrace that. So I think there's a real opportunity here, you know, that we could do that. And I think, you know, when you do that, sort of the benefits that flow from that, you know, be it they in terms of how we collect data and information, how we can then stimulate that innovation, how we can give that sort of you know, that hothouse opportunity to move things forward is really exciting. And I often feel in my sort of business area that's an opportunity that's lacking. And I think everything that we're talking about today gives a real challenge for of us to actually sort of make that a reality. And I think the other thing that's also really important is, again, from a business services perspective, is to understand just how strong the democratic mandate here is from local authorities to make this change happen. I mean, I don't think, climate change and everything around it's not something where a few of us sit in the corner and think maybe we should do something. I mean, this is front and centre as to where people are today. You only have to look at the behavioural change activity. Certainly from my own perspective, I've been tracking very carefully the environmental impact that COVID-19's had in terms of travel and energy use. You're looking at a number of days now where we're actually seeing green energy, energy from renewable sources. But then I also almost shudder at the same time when I look at the amount of plastic aprons, plastic masks, plastic goggles, and all those things which are essential from a health and safety perspective. But even now, we're now seeing reports of those things being found in the sea, being washed up on beaches. So in one sense, we've taken one, at least in the short term, a really step forward in this area. But on the other side of it, we've actually taken quite a step back, and it's getting that balance. So when people talk about that sort of almost environmental dividend that COVID-19's given, I'm thinking, well, yeah, in some areas it has, in other areas, I dread to think what we're going to be talking about for the next 10 years in terms of new waste and things that, we find, particularly in the sea, etc., which is all going to be traced back, to the last sort of 6 months across the world, because it's not just the UK. I mean, it's happening everywhere. So I think there's going to be some really good examples later. Mine are actually things working within sort of local authority environment. But I think if I was going to summarise in terms of how to sort of bring value, I think the way I would liken it is just sort of what I call buy well, pay well, use well, and make well. So buy well is about procuring your energy and your utility services and your environmental services in the best way, at the best price, as green as you can. Pay well is about making sure you're only paying for and using what you need. Use well is then with that solid baseline, and again, I think the whole graph earlier was a really good example, we can then focus on where that use is and what are the most effective, cost-effective, value-effective methods and technologies we can apply to reduce that energy. And with that in mind, we can then focus on how we make energy. So, it's actually always cheaper to reduce how you use energy than it is to try and generate it in some alternative form. If you actually look at the cost of PV or wind, it's actually much better to turn things off than it is to try and find new ways to feed things to let those keep running. So I think if you get that priority order, you actually end up with a circle, because what happens in that time, things change, the cost of energy changes, the views on environmental impact change, and so you can almost start that whole circle again, and it just keeps running and it keeps running, and that would really just be my sort of recommendation, really, that once you can get onto that circle, that circular service can just continue forever in terms of how we address this challenge.
Sadie, are you able just to put up the slides? Is that okay? Because I've only got 3, but don't panic, everybody, because whilst I am a lawyer, I'm not going to raise any law in these 3 slides. You'll be most pleased. In fact, the first one's actually an economist that I just thought, when I looked at it, it was quite a... Could you just move down, please, Sadie? Is that okay? Oh, we stuck.
Can you
not that one.
That one.
Yeah, it's the next one.
Next one.
Yeah, please. Yeah, okay.
That is.
I hope you can. Yeah, I hope you can read that. But basically, there's an economist who basically said only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depends on the ideas that are literally lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And I think that really is where we are at the moment, really, to be honest. We are in a crisis. We've got a crisis of climate change, but obviously we've got a crisis of COVID. Could you just move it down a slide? Is that okay? Right then. What we do at DWF is we obviously have lots of local authorities, that's great. But every year we think about what we can do, which our clients are thinking about, to try and produce something of thought leadership. So we have some ideas that are lying around to help people. So in the past, what we've done is we've done the future of the high street, and we've done the commercialisation of the public sector. So lo and behold, we thought, Jonathan and I and the team thought in January, what crisis is going to happen in 2020? This is in January. we thought, well, the climate emergency is the big crisis for 2020. So how wrong we were. However, what we thought we'd do with the LGC is we thought we'd do a round table, we'd do a survey, we'd do case studies from around the world. We're going to have a conference in September where we're going to get like-minded people to come and talk, and so we can share ideas to make sure that these ideas are lying around and that people actually know what others are doing. And also we've produced a report which brings all that together. And fundamentally, I suppose the key questions actually were pretty straightforward that we engaged with the LGC and the public sector on. It was, what are local authorities in the public sector doing to respond to the climate emergency? What's their appetite for it? What actions are they taking? What impediments do they have? And that's what we were hoping to get out of the report. Now, obviously, since we've done that, COVID has come along. But there's a couple of sort of interesting things you'd say about it, actually, in that COVID is a crisis, which is, potentially life-altering in terms of how we live our lives, and it's very life-threatening. Well, many would argue that climate change is just the same. I mean, the only thing that might be different is actually the scale upon which, that those things could impact. But anyway, it's interesting how the government has responded, because the government's responded to COVID, and I think quite rightly, with primary legislation, lots of guidance. I've been sending out every week the public procurement notices and public sector updates on COVID, and there is a whole heap of immediate action that's gone on. Whereas with climate change, I think it's probably been a bit more of a sort of, a bit more of a longer game. There isn't that legislative thing that sits behind it. So is it possible just to move down? And I'll just talk you through, because I'm very conscious of time. But I know, Peter, I know you like to keep on time, and you'll be telling me off later if I don't keep to time. So actually, let's just talk then just quickly about some of the key findings. And I think for me, you can read that, but actually let me just discuss them. There are really three key findings for me. The first is that climate emergency is an absolute top priority for many local authorities. It really goes to the core now of how they make decisions, what they do, how they select their suppliers. And I mean, indeed, Martin there was talking about Hull, and he's sort of saying, actually, we now know what we've got to focus on to reduce our carbon. So, Martin, I think it's fair to say you're going to look at your procurement, aren't you, to try and change the behaviour from the market in order to try and reduce, your consumption and so on.
Yeah, that's right.
That's absolutely right. So, so lots of authorities are doing that. Local authority pension funds are now categorising how they invest due to the carbon footprint and how services are delivered, and even from what type of buildings local authorities operate from. This is all now in the mix. Okay, so that is one clear thing that came through from our work with the LGC. So I recognise that this is a BSA LGC event. So the flip side of that, and it applies to lawyers too, by the way, this is why we did it, is that those in the private sector that get this in terms of what local authorities are trying to achieve and actually go beyond the superficial and really get stuck into the detail of delivering real sustainable services and reduce climate change, I think are going to do very well out of this, because they're going to be incentivised by local authorities and they're going to win more work. So not only are they going to go to heaven, but they're probably going to be a bit more profitable with it as well. I think that's just the direction of travel that we're going to. And then a third and final point before we will need to get to questions, Peter, I appreciate that, is that we are in a bit of a unique period. We've got to work out, it goes to the councillor's first slide actually, how we're going to restart our lives and restart our economy. And I think it's an interesting one, that, because in the one hand, what my public sector weekly bulletins have been which I've been sending out to clients on a weekly basis, is that the government knows that it's got to push lots of money through the public sector to deliver this. And therefore, what we are trying to do is to say those they call them shovel-ready projects. We're trying to influence the government to make sure the right shovel-ready projects are produced. But the flip side of that is that what I'm reading, because I act for a number of them, a lot of local authorities are really struggling now financially as a consequence of COVID. And I think we've got to accept that. It's not as simple as saying all this money government's going to come out to local authorities, it's going to be fine. Because actually at the moment, I think there's a real financial deficit for some really major authorities.
Well, welcome to session 2, which is about the partnership working in practice for the climate emergency. So we've got a few specific themes for discussion, which is about how local government and business and the voluntary charity and social enterprise sectors can work together to meet local carbon reduction goals. It's about best practice in incorporating sustainability in the public procurement process as well, including through the Social Value Act, and also about council's experiences of using the TOMs and of collaborative working. The TOMs, of course, are the themes, outcomes and measures. So we've got 4 speakers. You don't need me to remind you to keep to time, and although I just have done. And I'm also going to ask that we keep the questions for the question and discussion section, which is going to be in about 25 to 30 minutes time. So without further ado, maybe I could hand over to you, Elsa, to start with, and I'll let you, with all the speakers, I'll let you introduce yourselves and the organisations you represent. Thank you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me well? Good. Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I am Elsa Colonna, Business Development Manager for Veolia Energy Services. Today, I will talk to you about our partnership with a local authority, which is Leicestershire County Council. This is a partnership that was initiated by the authority to save energy and carbon across their building portfolio. Thank you, Sadie. So I will go to the first slide directly, please. And as we all know, this slide is a slide that ticks. TikTok runs the clock. The time is now. We all know it. And still, sometimes we feel like it goes too slow. So in terms of the building sector, because we were talking about our consumption earlier, we know in the UK that 34% of all the UK carbon emissions are estimated to come from the building sector. And the case study I will present today is showing how local authorities actually tackle this through green procurement. Can we go to the next slide, Sadie, please? A quick overview of Veolia. So for those who don't know this company, we work across water, waste, and energy. And in terms of our energy services, our mission is basically to implement energy solutions to meet the climate emergency. So this goes from large-scale projects like district heating networks to smaller energy retrofits for, among others, public buildings. And this includes a lot of innovation, smart monitoring, etc. So today, the example is about Leicestershire County Council, if we can go to the next slide. So it all begins with public sector commitments. And with Leicestershire County Council, it begins with their commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030. But when I say that it begins with those recent climate emergency commitments, most of you will know that it's not true. Actually, councils were already operating a long time ago for a better environment. And the case I'm presenting, if we can go to the next slide, is about a procurement that happened before the emergency declaration of Leicestershire County Council. What the council wanted to do was basically to procure a flexible and efficient single supplier to deliver energy efficiency and renewable energy projects across their building portfolio and their land. So what they did is they said, we want to have many technologies available to reduce consumption and generate low carbon energy. So this included LED lighting, controls upgrade, roof solar PV, solar carports, could be large scale solar farms, battery storage, EV charging, heat pumps, you name it. And Veolia became the delivery partner in 2018. In terms of social value, this also allows them, via the procurement handled by Veolia, to access local subcontractors and local workforce. If we can go to the next slide, I'm just going to present the way it works in 3 simple phases. So once the local authority has contracted a delivery partner, they can basically just send projects or bundle projects our way, And we have a gateway process together to build the best business case and implement only the projects that the authority really needs to reduce their costs and their carbon. The design phase has several gateways depending on the viability of the business case for the authority. The implementation phase is totally led by Veolia and our subcontractors. And then an important feature of the framework is the savings guarantee phase. This is where the council has actually de-risked their investment, and Veolia is guaranteeing a certain level of savings that is agreed during the design phase. So every year, our experts in measurement and verification send certified reports to the authority so that they are sure that the level of energy savings has been achieved. If you can go to the next slide. So far, the current results have actually triggered for the total lifetime of the projects 525 tons of CO2 savings, and this was mainly for LED and roof PV projects. You can see some small pictures of social centers there. And a key feature of the framework, which I think is very important for the authority, is that there is a collaborative approach to the pipeline. We can go from detailed discussion to high-level strategic discussions about technologies and about bundling projects, about timelines, etc. At the moment, we develop battery storage, carport, EV charging, and heat pump opportunities for the council. And to finish, what I think is important, because we talk about greening procurement and how we can make it better, I just want to leave you, if we can go to the next slide, please, Sadi, with a couple of ideas of why I think what Leicestershire County Council did was actually showing some climate leadership quite early on, if you may say. It's that they have built this framework first so that schools in their area could access a financed scheme in parallel to benefit from the delivery of savings projects. And two, they have opened the framework to public authorities in 50 miles radius of Leicestershire. So what that means is that they not only they access an efficient way and a streamlined way to actually act to save carbon on their estate, but they also authorize others who might not have the capacity to go through big procurements, for example, to access this in an easy way. So we're happy for any of you to actually enter in contact with them directly regarding accessing the framework or regarding the model of this framework. And if you have any question or want to be put in contact with them, you have my email on this slide, and I would be happy to be in touch as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elsa. Thank you. I'm going to move us along because we want to try and keep to time. But obviously, we've got the chat bar down the right-hand side. Did I get my rights and lefts mixed up earlier? I think I obviously did. I think you might have corrected me, Colin. Thank you. So the chat bar, as I'm looking to my right, so you can ask any questions of Elsa as we go through the next. Pay attention to the next presentations, obviously, but if you can multitask, then you can ask questions at the same time. So I'll hand over to Nathan, if I may. Nathan from Social Value Portal.
Thank you very much, Neil. I'm very happy for people to multitask while I talk, because that's the nature of these things. So just by way of quick introduction, I am one of the founder directors of a company called the Social Value Portal, and we do two things. We have a methodology for measuring and reporting on social value, and we have a digital platform which is designed to capture the activities that people do against that measurement framework and build up an information base and use that in a wide variety of ways. But procurement was the starting point for the Social Value Portal, so it was very much designed as a tool. And I guess in essence it's a behavioral tool in procurement. You know, it's about sending certain signals to the supplier base about the public sector's intent in terms of social value, and hopefully moving people's approaches to social value in the right direction as a result of that. And it also functions at a sort of corporate measurement level as well. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please, that would be great. So, and on to the one after that, that would be good as well. Perfect. So the first point I want to make, and I guess this goes back to a point that Colin made earlier on, and you know, the fact that there isn't necessarily any legislation driving environmental approaches in procurement. There is legislation around social value, as we've already alluded to, and it is now applicable across most of the UK. The only place in the UK that doesn't have a social value law is Northern Ireland. So that creates an opportunity, and what we're seeing is that people are thinking about social value in very much what many of us would have called in days gone by as a triple bottom line approach. So it's very much about the economic, the social and the environmental well-being of societies and of places. And that aligns very effectively with things like the National Performance Framework in Scotland and the Future Generations goals in Wales, for example. So it's there, and we want to see it used to drive forward behavioural change that benefits the environment. If we move on to the next slide, please. One of the really interesting things here is of course that this approach to doing business, to working, that's coming from the public sector, is beginning to line up with the way in which the global investment community is thinking about their role. For a number of years running now, we've had the really interesting situation of a big investment company like BlackRock saying we have to do more than make money from our investment to justify our existence, and there's been a real shift there. So those two things are coming together, and they come together very well around the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is that really colourful box you see in the bottom right-hand corner there. I'm going to rattle through this stuff really quickly, so hopefully that gives us a bit more time for questions. But I'm very happy to come back and talk about it in more detail, either now or in the chat or afterwards or whatever. So let's move on, yes please, to the next slide, which is the National TOMS. So the National TOMS was designed over the course of about 18 months by bringing together a cross-sector, cross-industry task force of public, private sector, industry specialists and social value, academics and so on, to design a reporting standard for social value. And it always had those three key themes: environmental, economic and social in it, and progressively over the last 2 or 3 years it's become a very well established mechanism for reporting and measuring and tendering for social value, particularly in the local authority sector. So we're beginning to get to a point where we have a lot of interesting evidence, we have a lot of data about projects. The portal currently hosts around 1,600 projects, and people are the key thing about the TOMS framework is that it's open source, so anyone can use it. We obviously like people to work with us, but you don't have to, and it's been designed so that all of the guidance that you need in order to use it effectively and in a way that is methodologically consistent comes with that open source tool that you download. So the use goes much wider than the customers that work with the social value portal. This obviously creates a really interesting opportunity, I think, to standardize a number of areas of social value across the piece. One of those key areas obviously is the environmental sector. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, I always put this one in because I just like it. So coming back to that point about the Sustainable Development Goals, it's really important that these ways of thinking about our world and thinking about what we need to do to drive change have a coherence and a consistency about them. They tie together. There are different ways of looking at this, but if you can tie them together and correlate them, then that massively increases the chances of action on a broad scale. So we've done the exercise of tying the TOMs back to the global goals or the sustainable development goals in order to do that, so that we're part of a narrative that is a narrative for the whole planet. Okay, next slide, please. So for us, we launched the third iteration of the national TOMs just before lockdown, actually, back end of January 2020, and this is called the 2020 TOMs. And I guess the critical thing about the 2020 TOMs, the big thing that shifted from the previous two versions, was the increased emphasis on environmental measures in the measurement framework, and that comes about because of the increasing need and increasingly urgent need to tackle climate change, the need to kind of embed it in our business behaviours, and perhaps we sort of stood away from this challenge a little bit in the earlier versions of the TOMs, really because we thought there was a lot of environmental measurement out there already. But I think what we see is that the TOMs functions really well as that behavioural tool for transactions. It's very much a practical, transactionally based thing that sort of drills down and you know, oversimplifies in a number of ways, and I'd be the first to accept that. But by oversimplifying, it gets it to a point where a large proportion of people, both on the public sector side and on the business side, can engage with something where they can see the outcomes coming from it and understand the differences that these things will make. So we've driven that right down to specific measures that we think people can take up and run with. Some interesting discussion in the chat about the weighting attributed to environmental factors in procurement, and I think there's a debate to be had about all of that. And one of the challenges, one of the ways in which the TOMs is not perfect, and it's not perfect in many ways, is that there are certain measures in the TOMs that carry much greater weight than other measures because of the value attached to them. And the problem for the environmental measures is that if you take the evidence base for pricing carbon, then you don't get to the sort of numbers that you need to really shift the dial in terms of the environmental component of the TOMs. When a supplier is making a proposal, they're going to get a much bigger hit by proposing a large proportion of supply chain spend than they ever could possibly dream of in the environmental side of things. So that's definitely something that we need to think about and have a discussion about collectively, and think about how the tool can be used more effectively to prioritize the environmental factors. And it may be, as I was suggesting earlier on, it may be about a compliance element to this, or it might be about how you weight the different components within the framework, and all of that is possible. But it gives you a starting point. The other point I would make in applying the TOMs framework is that what we find is that very often suppliers are enthusiastic about bringing forward proposals to address climate change within the TOMs, but actually providing the rationale and the evidence base to back those proposals up it can be much harder. The quality of the reporting on the environmental side, for example, actually providing evidence or providing a rationale for how you're going to save 100 or 200 tons of carbon is surprisingly perhaps really not at the standards that it needs to be in order to embed this sort of behavior consistently in the supply chain, in the public sector supply chain. So I think collectively we have a duty to focus on the evidence base for environmental measures and get those to a standard where we are really sure that actually people are delivering what they say they are delivering under these things. So that's what I wanted to say on the environmental side. So just to kind of wrap up very quickly, if I go to the next slide, if that's okay. Yeah. So this is my sort of final slide in this short piece. It was so I've got a quote as well from Thomas Piketty, who back in September, actually before COVID hit, said that global warming and the rise in inequality are parallel and connected challenges, and the biggest ones facing us in the beginning of the 21st century. And I think the COVID crisis has shown that and made that very, very clear. And what we need to do as we move forward is think about that connection between going green and addressing inequality, and one is probably not going to happen without the other. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. So we are running slightly behind, but there's some really good chat happening at the same time. There was the fact that the crisis has shown major behavioural change is possible is really encouraging. I guess what's niggling away at me, as I mentioned at the very beginning, was that a threat of the race back to normal. So we've clearly got a huge opportunity at the moment, haven't we, to capitalise in the best possible way. So, well, I'll move us on. Carl, can I hand over to you to do your introduction and to, I'm not sure if you've got any slides, but I will hand over to Carl Limbert.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So yeah, no slides from me. Thanks to the previous speakers, some really interesting comments so far. And I guess thanks to everyone who's stayed online and resisted the temptation to go out and have an ice cream, given that it's a glorious day and about 31 degrees according to my watch at the moment. So thanks for your attention. I'll try and rattle through this pretty quickly. So I'm Director of Strategy for ENGIE UK. I just wanted to say 4 things really. So firstly, I just wanted to make a quick comment on, I guess, the bridge between COVID and the climate emergency and some of the comments that have been kind of flicking up on the chat panel. So I think what's interesting is that effectively it's taken a 20% contraction in GDP to achieve an 8% reduction in carbon emissions in this year. And so clearly none of us kind of wants to go through the former to achieve the latter again. But I think that does tell us something really interesting about the scale of change and the pace of change that's going to be required to meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement. So I think that's kind of worth keeping in mind. Secondly, I just wanted to give a bit of context about ENGIE. So ENGIE's mission statement is make zero carbon happen. That's been our mission statement since 2015 when we committed to meeting the requirements of the Paris Agreement. We basically do 4 things. So we're an energy company, very, very big producer of clean energy. So we do everything from grid scale assets like offshore wind, solar, pumped hydro, all the way through to supply. And we do supply to local authorities and other large corporates. And then in between that, we do kind of renewables, all scales, and local heat and power systems on a low carbon basis too. We're a pretty big services company, so we principally do digital and built environment services, and we're able to orient both of those towards the zero carbon agenda. And again, we can do that anything from the scale of a kind of campus down to an individual house, and we do that. Thirdly, we are a regeneration provider. So we're one of the few contractors in the UK that have done low carbon housing retrofit. So again, we can do that at the scale of an individual unit or the scale of a tower block, and we do both. And we're currently converting a former coal-fired power station into a 2,300 home low carbon village on a new build basis, which is really designed to be pretty disruptive to both the housing development model and the energy model in the UK. So we like to be able to bring all of that together into a kind of coherent proposition for achieving net zero. The other thing that we do is investment. And I think this is really important going back to the COVID point. So I think the politics of the recovery are still forming. I don't think we've really kind of seen the shape of that yet. But the one thing that we can be certain of is massive levels of public sector debt and private sector debt. And if we're going to achieve net zero, we're going to have to shift to low carbon infrastructure. And to do that in that context is almost certainly going to require private investment. So I think we probably all need to have that on our agenda too. The second thing I wanted to say is that we as a business are really clear that local authorities have a really prominent role in the transition to net zero. And I just wanted to give 3 examples of why we think that. So if we think of the kind of the wicked issues that the country faces, let's take decarbonisation of heat. So local authorities will play a massive role in that, principally through the role they can play in district energy systems. So it's really, really encouraging to see the BEIS, HNDU and HNIP funding streams both consistently oversubscribed, and really encouraging to see the CCC predicting a growth in supply from district energy from, I think it's currently less than 1%, up to about 20% of the nation's supply. So local authorities have a massive game-changing role to play there. Development of low carbon housing and development of low carbon retrofit. The UK just won't hit its 2050 target unless it gets a serious grip on that. Local authorities have a huge role to play in terms of them being the local planning authority, and there's a kind of day's worth of seminars that we could do on low carbon planning. But I think more near term, there's something really interesting that local authorities can do in terms of low carbon retrofit of social housing stock that they retain. So something really interesting to talk about there. And then finally, transport. So again, local transport authority. Local authorities have a huge role to play, both in kind of encouraging modal shift, but also as the kind of anchor, I suppose, anchor party for EV infrastructure. And we've seen quite a lot of movement on that in the last 2 years, especially in response to the whole air quality agenda. So it's the 3 areas in which the local government can really kind of shift the dial on wicked issues in the UK. And then the final thing I just wanted to say really quickly was to just talk about the case studies that we've submitted in support of this seminar. So I think these will be going up on the LGA website in the next couple of weeks. But there's one in particular that I think is worth looking at. So following on from this idea that we think local authorities have a crucial role to play, we've published a kind of thought leadership piece on this that you can download from our website. It's called How to Solve a Problem Like Net Zero. Happy to share the link in the comments bar. But I guess the gist in this is that, so this is about more than kind of just investing in sort of certain infrastructure projects here or certain transport projects there. It really comes down to place-based leadership. And there is no other organisation in the country that is better set up for place-based leadership than local authorities. So I think the contribution that Hull made earlier on in the webinar was superb in that respect. And we absolutely want to work alongside local authorities who want to pick up the mantle in that respect. So happy to have contributed to that debate. And then the other case studies that we've submitted are really all around, I guess, the more project specific stuff. So we have stuff around zero carbon roadmap, which is a really important thing for councils to engage in. Delivery and design of district energy systems, delivery and design of EV, and the delivery and design of low carbon housing. So huge and exciting agenda, really pleased to be a part of it, and really happy to be part of the debate today. So thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Carl, it's really good, thank you. I kind of get a sense of a load more things to add to the to-do list. And then it comes down to political priorities as well, then, doesn't it? So both at a local and national level. So there are some really good comments and questions coming into the chat bar that I'm sure you can see. We are running over time, but we've got that chat facility there, so let's keep that going. And then last but not least, today's speakers, we've got Katie Sargent from Surrey. So Katie, over to you, please.
Hi, everyone. So great, thanks, Sadie. It takes a weight off my shoulders that I don't have to share my screen, which is something I always struggle with for some reason. So I'm Katie Sargent, and I'm the Environment Group Commissioning Manager from Surrey County Council. So I don't actually sit within the procurement team at Surrey, but I do work very closely with them as climate change comes under my remit. And before I start, I should probably just mention as well that at Surrey, procurement sits under our Orbis shared service, which also includes East Sussex and Brighton and Hove County Council. So if I just move us on to the next slide. Great. So just to give you a tiny bit of background, Surrey, like many other local authorities, has declared a climate change emergency and has set a target to be net zero carbon by 2050. So as a result, we have done a piece of work which was led by Leeds University to look at sort of a science-based approach to how we would reach that target with keeping ourselves within that sort of 1.5 global temperature increase. And I think that was mentioned earlier up in the meeting chat. I think some other local authority partners have been doing that same sort of thinking. So our climate change strategy is very much based on that work that was done by Leeds. And as part of that, Leeds very helpfully set us some carbon reduction targets over a period of every 5 years. And you'll see that they're extremely challenging. So we need to get to a 46% reduction in Surrey by 2025. And I should just point out as well that these are scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we haven't included scope 3 emissions in the scope at this point. However, we do have an ambition to add them in when we've done basically the work that Hull have done, which is part of our intention. So that strategy has now been endorsed and we're working through a development approach. So if we move on to the next slide, I've taken 2 actions from the strategy which really relate to our green procurement ambitions. And the first one is our sort of short-term ambition to basically embed climate change and sustainability within our procurement practices and to work closely with our supply chain to understand the impacts on them and look for opportunities where we can work together with our markets because we think that that is probably the best way of approaching this. And then the longer term ambition is that basically climate change will become embedded in all the decisions that the council make on behalf of the county and for our organisation, and that will just become sort of our business as usual approach. So just on that point, we are committed to having a green procurement policy, which we don't currently have, and that is going to align with a refresh of our contract standing orders, which is also quite helpful because it means that we've got some flexibility to basically do things in a slightly different way. And one of the things is we're looking at potentially having a 4th evaluation criteria for our procurement, which is specific to climate change. Again, some of the comments that were mentioned earlier in the chat about whether that's, whether it's possible to do that in alignment with procurement regs is something we'll explore. But also the requirement for our providers to basically declare to us their apportioned emissions for the contracts they deliver on behalf of Surrey and to set carbon reduction targets. So if we move on to the next slide. So I've mentioned how we feel that collaborating with our supply chains and our markets is really key. It's very apparent to us at least that we aren't going to achieve the targets in our climate change strategy unless we work closely with our private sector and with our supply chain. We know that a lot of the ideas already exist, particularly around sort of new technologies, and what we're trying to do now is to work with supply chains to basically meet with them regularly, have discussions about, update them on our pipeline, and talk about our ambitions around climate change particularly. So I've put some examples there of some conversations we've had recently with them. And just to flag as well that we've also started to embed some clauses within our contractual agreements around our single-use plastic policy and also embedding sustainable timber. So if I can just move on to the next slide. So just to follow on from the social value portal, we also have quite a strong emphasis around social value at Surrey. So we have a social value charter, which is based very much on the SVP principles. And that is applied to all procurements over 100,000, and we give a weighting of between 5 and 10%. The activity has to be delivered in Surrey, and we have 3 outcomes specifically for environment, which I've listed here. And beneath those sit a number of actions that providers have access to when they're tendering. We have some proxy financial values against those. So, for example, ton of carbon saved. We've also got a proxy financial value for volunteering hours for environmental activities. And the way that works then is that value, that financial value for each tender is factored in and assessed as part of the evaluation criteria. So that's the approach that we've taken, and it, over the last couple of years at Surrey, it has really paid dividends in terms of what we're now seeing in terms of delivery and social value. So if we just move on to the next slide, this is my last slide. So I was asked to really talk about some case studies. So ways that we're basically embedding climate change into sort of the requirements of some of our contracts. So not just through social value, but through the delivery itself. So I've pulled out a couple of examples here. And we've recently reprocured our car club contract. That's gone to enterprise, and that's a 4-year contract. And within that, we have now set a target that 50% of the car club fleet will need to be electric by the end of the contract. So that target is in there. And we're also using this as an opportunity to sort of change the way travel expenses at Surrey are done, as we have access to our fleet, our car club vehicles at our facilities and our buildings. This is probably more relevant in a normal world as opposed to a COVID world, but we're changing the way officers can put in their travel expenses, which requires them to go onto the enterprise portal to put in the details of their journey and their own vehicle details, so to enable a comparison in terms of cost and carbon if they were to use one of the car club vehicles. And the intention obviously is that this will reduce emissions from our grey fleet, because if the cost and the carbon of using their own vehicle for the journey is higher, then they won't be able to claim the travel expense for it. We're also starting to put in place a green vehicle policy, which has been sort of triggered by the fact that our vehicle lease hire contract is coming up for renewal. And we've identified that we need to have some measures, some sort of requirements that push us towards sort of more electric vehicles or ultra low emission vehicles within our own fleet. We've looked at embedding climate change within our extra care housing contracts. So this is basically a design and build and operational contracts for additional extra care properties within the county. So climate change has been built into the design requirements, as well as the output specification, which is focusing on how those buildings will be used with regards to energy and water use. And finally, I'll just mention the waste disposal contract that is coming up for reprocurement as well. So this, obviously, as a county council, we are responsible for waste disposal, and that requires working very closely with the boroughs and districts who are responsible for waste collection. So this contract gives us huge opportunities to basically improve our recycling rates and push up our food waste collection, which obviously links to green energy production through the burning of that food waste. But also there's huge social value opportunities through this contract as well. So with our CRCs, we have reuse shops, and our intention is to really push those to deliver more, looking at sort of more of a circular economy approach, where we're sort of picking up bits of waste that can be upcycled, such as furniture, and donated to people in the county who are in need, and also to sort of factor in job opportunities for potentially for ex-offenders or people with learning disabilities. So these are just a few sort of snapshots of some current examples of the way we're trying to embed climate change and social value more widely into our procurement activity. So just mindful of time, I will stop there. So I'll hand back over to Neil. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Katie. So in a really interesting turn of events, we've finished just as the questions were due to finish. But if I can check with LGA colleagues and Colin and Peter as well, I think we've had some really interesting presentations there this afternoon. Loads of good chat in the chat bar. I don't even want to attempt to pick out some questions from that, to be honest. There's so many good.
You coward, Neil.
Well, okay. Well, if you insist. No, I'm just thinking. Yeah, we've got 5 minutes. I think we've got to do a few conclusions. So should we do that, Grace? Is that okay? And obviously, there's loads of really good links and so on have been put in the meeting chat. And yeah. So I've got a few things to say. Colin's got a few things to say. Then I think we hand to Peter. So shall I do my bit now? Then Colin, you, then Peter. Does that work with everyone? Seeing as I've got the floor, I'm just going to go for it. So, well, on behalf of the LGA, thank you very much. And for local authority colleagues, what can we do? We're given a few prompts here. So it's about letting businesses know what they need. I think in one of the very early presentations, it talked about, I think it was from Hull actually, who spoke about working effectively with private sector partners, clearly promoting social value. And I put a comment in there. I attended the social value conference in December. I think it seems like a long time ago now. Clearly there's an opportunity to really push on with that. And then of course, continue to share good practice. And the LGA has a whole load of resources online. If you haven't looked and checked them out already, go and have a look. Which leads me on to that point. So there's lots of resource online about climate change improvement and support program resources, which you can find online. You can get in touch with climate@local.gov.uk, which I think Grace will probably email from that address as well. Of course, follow the LGA on Twitter, and there is a spotlight on Green Reset, which is on July the 1st, part of the LGA annual conference. It was going to be in Harrogate this year. But obviously that's not happening. So for the first time, it's virtual. It spreads over the next couple of weeks. It's free to local gov to attend, and you can go online. I've had a look this morning, actually. All the events are currently publicised online, so you can go online and register. So that should be really good. So thank you very much for putting up with me chairing this second session this afternoon, and I will hand over to Colin. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Councillor. I mean, I'm conscious of time. I've only got about 3 or 4 points, but the first one really is just to thank everybody for their contributions. I mean, it's actually quite uplifting to hear so many local solutions, whether that's from the private or the public sector. And I absolutely agree that I think no one party is going to crack this. We're just going to have to work together and sort it out between us, frankly, and do the best that we can. I really enjoyed Katie's practical steps. I reverted to being a lawyer at the end there by thinking, yes, she's amended her contract standing orders, she's amended her procurements, her waiting, she's amended her contracts, and she's actually started to get the corporate priorities into the nitty gritty of how they conduct their business. And I really think you have to be commended for that, Katie, and I think that's great. And the final thing really for me is just as we emerge from COVID, I do think we've got a unique opportunity to reset how we live our lives and how we conduct ourselves, and let's take the opportunity, please. So that's it.